for me, coming to you today as, let's say, someone who has worked on making rules for the world of data and AI, I had a playful approach to the digital over 6 years. It took us 6 years to put in place the General Data Protection Regulation, which is the privacy protecting regulation which we have in Europe. For me, that's a great start because, of course, from the point of the law, talking about data, there's a huge difference between these two systems. Namely, one system deals very clearly with personal data, that's in the hospital, patient data, and the other one can discuss it. We know the air traffic controller, that's probably not personal data, the airplanes. Of course, there's the name of the pilot maybe involved, but generally speaking, traffic data, when it's not an identifiable one person in the car, that's of course personal data. The traffic data of your car, that is you. But in the airplane, I would say that's not personal data. So although from a technical point of view, it's comparable, and one system can learn from the other, and I thought it's a fascinating idea to transpose the air traffic control system management to the hospital. When we work with data, I think this is the first very important point of distinguishing and where systems really have to go different ways. Are we dealing with personal data, namely data which identifies a human or makes it possible to identify a human, and I will say a word about this, or are we dealing with other data, industrial data, machine data, robot data, which is not related specifically to a human being? And why is that so? Well, because at least in Europe, there's a fundamental right on the highest level of the law, on the constitutional level, that personal data of people is protected. They cannot be a commodity. They cannot just be traded. They are not like oil or money. Sometimes people sloppily, I would say, they just burst out and say, data, that's the oil of the future, that's the currency of the future. Well, no. Personal data is not oil or currency. Why? Because it's not a standardized commodity which can be traded. It is our individual lives which is embodied in these data, and therefore we can exactly not treat this data like a tradable commodity like oil or money. So this is therefore where I would say when you work with AI and with data, your radar has to be up a little bit, I would say, even as engineer and systems developer. And you have to start thinking about what does it mean I deal here with people, I deal here with personal data, and there may be other law applying. And let me say a word to you, mostly, I think, American audience today in the room, about the relevance of European rules for you. If you work on a system where you want global scalability, and you want to reach, the global reach of Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and so on, it's very good to think about this from the outset, because from an economic point of view, of course, it's best if you have a digital model, an AI model, which you can scale worldwide. And so, for example, Microsoft has decided to give worldwide to its customers GDPR rights. It means for its business model, whatever they do, they comply worldwide with the European General Data Protection Regulation, which is probably the most sophisticated legal system to protect personal data. So if you have ambitions in the marketplace which go beyond America, or if you treat data from other continents, in particular Europe, you have to think about this division from the outset. But how do you identify personal data when it's not clear, when it's not directly relating to a person? So there's this formulation, personal data is data which identifies a person, that's clear, or which makes it possible to identify a person. What is this type of data? And I would like to stay a little bit in the world of Julie, namely machine data. And I would like to give you a simple rule of thumb when machine data is personal data and when it's not personal data. And the simple rule of thumb is this: if the machine moves with an individual, if it's a device which someone can carry, a handheld device, if it's a car, if people can take it along, or if it's a device which is regularly only run by one person, then probably this machine data which is coming out of this machine is personal data. Why? Because the machine tells us about the human being behind it. On the other hand, machine data which comes from stationary data, from stationary machines which don't move with the person, and which are not regularly just managed by one person, that's probably not personal data, and therefore you don't fall under this pretty stringent legal regime. So let me give you a few of these elements of this legal regime, and let me make clear from the outset that also in artificial intelligence context, this regime applies. Whenever AI treats personal data, data which identifies a person or makes it possible to identify a person, it applies. In this regime, you have first of all an obligation to collect only as much data as you need for the purpose, the specific purpose for which you are, on which you're working and for which you are collecting the data. So here you have a conflict with something which is very fashionable here in Boston at the MIT and so on, the big data theory, which says collect everything and your learning will be maximum. When it's about personal data, that becomes a risk. That's why companies like Apple, they try to move processing to the edge. They like to keep the data on the mobile phone. They don't want it to come back to their central systems because they don't want to be falling foul with the rule to collect only a minimum of data and rather keep it with you. You also must have the ability to prove that your processing is legal. And the rule is you must be clear what is the ground of legality of your processing. That doesn't mean you have to ask for permission, but you have to look into the law. There are 7 reasons why processing and how processing can be legal, and one is consent. But it's not the only one. For example, in the medical area, you may have a law which says, you know, whenever someone comes into your medical practice who has a communicable disease, please register the name and report it to this or that authority so that public health services can follow the propagation of communicable diseases. So there you don't need consent. The law says it. You might need the data for the fulfillment of a contract. That's also a reason of legal processing. But you have to think about what is the basis, the legal basis for my processing. And then as to the process of processing itself, and there we are back into AI system, applies all to AI systems who treat personal data. You must document these processing systems. You must really write down, you know, the process is this and this and this, and then this happens, and then we do this and this. This with the data, it must be properly documented, and you must make an impact assessment. You must assess what it means for the individual dignity, individual self-determination of the individual. What does it mean for protection of data? What does it mean for privacy that you process this data? Now in Europe, in theory, and here we are now back a little bit to the theme of Scott, you know, talking and doing, the law says if you don't comply, the fine is up to 4% of your world turnover. Sounds huge. But right now, America is leading. The Americans are doers. You know, in Europe we write laws and then the authorities, you know, take a long time to think about how to apply the law and, you know, reflect. In short, you may have read that the FTC, so first we approved this law in Europe, which was a big outrage, you know, huge industry lobbying against it also from European industry, American industry, of course, totally against it. 4% of world turnover, that's outrageous, and, you know, we'll go bankrupt and, you know, obstacle to innovation, la, la, la. And really also in the American press you could read a lot about it, and then the law was adopted, and then silence. And then comes America. The FTC imposes a fine of $5 billion on Facebook for similar issues. I would say the difference is this. In America, if you promise something publicly to your customers or publicly on your website, in your prospectuses, you have to comply with it. So if you make privacy promises, you don't hold them, you get in trouble with the FTC. And that's what happened to Facebook. In Europe, it doesn't matter what you promise, the law says you have to do it. And then, theoretically, you get into trouble with the data protection authorities, which are like the FTC. So right now, America, in terms of doing, is actually leading on enforcement of privacy rules, at least on the bigger scale. What's happening actually sort of to the mid-sized and smaller companies, it's less clear. The FTC is, of course, a Washington-based body. It sounds big, but actually, if you think of the size of the American market and the number of people working in this area, it's actually quite small. From time to time, someone hears that also state attorneys are now investigating here and there on privacy issues. And of course, in America, you also now have, in some states, privacy rules, like in California now, or in the state of Washington, which, where people say they are inspired by the European law, but which don't go as far. For example, in California, there's actually no limitation on you collecting data. It's only a limitation on passing on the data to others. So let me move from this existing law, which already applies to AI, and I just wanted to draw your attention that AI is not like the internet at the beginning, completely free of law. You remember, John Perry Barlow, the texter of the Grateful Dead, who did his declaration of the independence of cyberspace at the World Economic Forum in 1996, where he said, you governments, you parliaments have no legitimacy on the internet, we solve our problems ourselves. This whole spirit of leave it unregulated and so on, I think that's finished. And in AI now, in this time, already the laws which are there for digital, like GDPR, they apply. But what's in store beyond that for the future? I think the learning from the unregulated internet, if you now look at issues of incitement to violence, hate speech on the internet, if you look at Cambridge Analytica, how data of Facebook was used to covertly influence the elections in the US from the outside, from the inside, to steal the Brexit vote in the UK and so on. I think people start to understand that the unregulated internet has huge costs in terms of how democracy functions, in terms of respect for fundamental rights and the rule of law. And that's why there is a rethinking taking place, not only in Europe, but also in the United States. You may have read the article of Mark Zuckerberg on the 30th of March in the Washington Post, where he said, we need laws. We need laws in America to protect personal data. We need laws on cybersecurity, more of them. We need laws on portability of data between companies. If you're locked in with your data in Facebook and you want to go to a competitor, how do you actually do it? Think of airline loyalty programs. If you want to change the airline loyalty program, if you don't have the right that your data is directly transferred, that's called portability, and we have it in GDPR in Europe, the market competition really doesn't work for you because you're completely locked in. So Mark Zuckerberg said it in this article. This was a real, I would say, change of heart. In the new book of Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, is called Tools and Weapons, which already tells you the double head, the Janus head of digital technology. It can be great tools, but they can also become weaponized. He says also, yes, we need the politics to make decisions on these very important questions of individual freedom, individual autonomy, self-determination, because people are being manipulated on the basis of the profiles of data which are built about them, and they're not only manipulated in their buying decisions. That's the job of many companies here on the expo floor, the marketing guys, how far do you go? But they're also being manipulated in their democratic vote. And, is that the end of democracy? Maybe, if you win only because you're a great manipulator through data profiles and AI, is that good for politics? Is that good how to determine who is going to run the country? I would say no. And I think increasingly people are saying yes, no, that's not the right way. So all these thoughts lead to a new, let's say, resurgence of the law and acceptance also by big Silicon Valley and big IT companies also in America that we need laws to shape the age of AI. And that's what we're working on now in the European Commission in Brussels. Our President-elect, Mrs. von der Leyen, we are now just in an appointment process where candidates for the Commission are heard by Parliament and so on. She has said within 100 days of the new European Commission being in office, we will present a proposal to regulate AI so that it complies with our fundamental values, which basically means civil liberties and dignity of mankind and individual self-determination and democracy. So 100 days from the Commission taking office, that means March, April next year, we will come out with a proposal. And people are working on it. And there's already a lot of literature on this. And of course, I can't anticipate on what the politicians will decide what to put on the table, but I can give you some taste of what this is about. So we remember when personal data is concerned, you have already GDPR, which also, by the way, gives people information rights about looking into the algorithm, looking into the program, asking you, which data do you have about me, asking you to delete the data if they don't like your service anymore or without any reason. So all these rights already apply. So, of course, if you have to make new law, the first question is, well, what's already covered by old law? And I would say for personal data, a lot of issues on AI are covered. So the scope of the new measure will probably be more on non-personal data, but not exclusively. And I give you an example of what I think personally needs to be covered in this new law, which is a very simple thing. We need to know, as humans, when we deal with AI. If we have a voice talking to us somewhere, we want to know, is this a human or is this a machine? If we open up Facebook or Twitter in the morning, in particular when you come closer to election, and you get all these messages who say, Trump is great. Well, it's kind of good to know, are these all humans? Or are these maybe machines producing these messages? So a simple rule on transparency, which obliges all who put AI into the world, whether in the form of a robot or on the internet, that when this program communicates with a human in a way which could be taken for human communication, there must be a disclaimer. There must be something which says, I'm actually a machine. Like in journalistic publications, if somebody pays for content, the law says there must be a line which says this is not editorial content. Because otherwise, understanding the world becomes difficult. So this transparency point on AI, I think it needs to be an obligation for all to play along. Then, shouldn't we have a system which obliges those who develop AI and put it out there for market purposes or also for the public interest, namely the state, using it, shouldn't they be obliged to do an impact assessment of their technology against all existing law and against the question, could there be an impact on democracy? Could there an impact be on other civil liberties? Non-discrimination, for example, is a classic. Could there be an impact on safety? That is, of course, obvious. So I think there will be something which is an attempt to grade the programs by risk. I call it the pyramid of risk, the pyramid of criticality. There will be something which is a pyramid of criticality which says if programs only touch a few people, are not relevant for fundamental rights, pose no safety issue, you probably don't need to make an impact assessment which is complex and to make it public. But on the other hand, if your programs touch on health, very intimate things of human being, and if they potentially used for very important decisions like, are we going to operate, medical decisions, which can have huge impacts if they go wrong, then probably the obligation of impact assessment will be higher. And so I think in the end there will be 3, 4, 5 groups of risk where the intensity of impact assessment increases with the relevance of the program for individuals and for society. And then the question is, do we also need to equip government and authorities to check on these things? Do we need bodies which license these programs? And I think, again, this pyramid of criticality here will be relevant, because there will certainly be many programs which, why should they be licensed? If you use AI to fill your fridge at home, who cares? But on the other hand, every car which we put on the road must go through type approval. You cannot just put a car on the road like you want it, at least not in Europe. I don't know what it is in the United States. Cars must be checked first, because we have so many of them and they are so important for society and they kill people. So I think from a certain level of risk, there will be a system of first your self-impact assessment being looked at by an authority, and then on a higher level of risk, even maybe a need of an ex-ante assessment process carried out by a third party or by government. So that it is not going to be enough for the high-risk programs which are used for many, many people, which can be used in many, many contexts, just to do self-assessment. This is going to be, of course, a long legislative process. You can all participate in it. I've learned that Americans are much better in lobbying than Europeans. You have the experience in Washington and the great democracy of America. You have learned lobbying. And so it will take 1 or 2 years until this law is adopted. But my invitation to you is, as engineers and developers, participate in this debate. We are moving into a society where it's very, very important that those who know about technology, like Julie, that they participate in politics, that they explain what is happening, so that those who have to make democratic decisions about the rules according to which we live can make the right decisions, have the ability of foresight, understand the capability of the technology. And for democracy, it's good anyway if the engineers, which are more and more, and which have more and more power over all parts of life, because as we heard from Julie, AI is an all-purpose technology. It will be everywhere. So if the engineers have this power, I think a fortiori it's very, very important that engineers come back and participate in forms of democratic decision-making and bring in their knowledge, but also take back a responsibility as citizen in a democratic society when they work on their technology. So thank you very much for the invitation, and happy to discuss with you some questions.